What I remember most about that evening was the dust. As I sat on my veranda at the Marriott Hotel in El Paso, Texas, I stared across the river at Ciudad Juarez in Mexico. And as the evening twilight glowed, what I could see was only a golden haze hovering over that troubled city. But the haze itself did not respect borders, so it moved across the Rio Grande River to the first neighborhood that it encountered, Segundo Barrio. Segundo Barrio is the home to immigrants. It is the first stopping place and home to many who have traveled north into our country. Over 50% of the people who live in Segundo Barrio are foreign-born, and it is among one of the poorest zip codes in the United States. And that's where I would be traveling the next day. And I was excited about this trip because I was part of a Hewlett-Packard endowment team that was bringing a 5-year gift of money and equipment to improve the schools so we would greatly enhance the educational offering in this impoverished neighborhood. I was excited because I knew our gift would transform their lives. But truly, the life that was transformed the most that next day was mine. For as I took the tour that our host gave us throughout the barrio, I quickly came to have to set aside a lot of my preconceived notions. For although there was quite evident poverty and the homes were very, very modest, one of the things I noticed about the homes is they were all incredibly clean and brightly painted. In almost every yard, there was a statue or some other representation of their faith. The children, as they went off to school that morning, were neatly dressed, some in school uniforms. And what struck me is that almost all of them were laughing and singing and smiling. And get this, the neighbors were actually talking to each other as they passed each other on the street. Could barely believe it based on the city I was coming from. Once I got to the school, I was also caught by surprise because the building was old. The furnishings and equipment were very modest, but it was one of the cleanest school buildings inside and out that I had ever experienced. And so as I ended that day, I had to come to grips with the arrogance that I had carried with me into Segundo Barrio. For I felt that our gift would transform them. But I realized that what they already had was of far greater value than the money and computers we were bringing. For their gift of joy, of faith, and of thankfulness for what they had far outweighed the meager gift of funds and equipment that we were bringing. In today's gospel reading, we hear that the humble will be exalted and the exalted will be humbled. Well, that day, I was humbled. You know, humility is not an attribute that is very popular in our society today. Let me give you a couple of examples. Over the past couple of weeks, we've had the opportunity to watch the Olympics. I'm a bit of an Olympic nut. I watch as much as I can, even synchronized swimming. And we had a lot to be proud of as a country, as once again our country won the greatest number of medals of all the nations. But one of the things that struck me was comments by some of those who were commentating on the events. For it seemed that unless an American won gold, it was somehow a failure. We didn't even show a lot of the events where Americans weren't competing. Even silver and bronze at times didn't seem good enough. The other thing that struck me is that 20 years ago and even 10 years ago, I often noticed that when athletes would complete their competitions, they would give thanks to God for their performance. During the number of hours I watched of the Olympics, which was far more than would be healthy to admit, I only saw 2 examples of this happening. Instead, I saw a lot of fist pumps, of wagging fingers of number 1, of beckoning the crowd to give them more adulation. humility was very rarely on display in those Olympics. And if I turn my attention to the American political campaign, you're all shaking your head no already. Humility, personal humility, is not in evidence. In fact, I think the motto of these campaigns should be, the exalted shall be exalted, and the humbled shall be humbled. And yet, despite the fact that humility is not much on display in our society today, Scripture continues to call us to that very virtue. In fact, throughout all of the Old Testament and the New Testament, there are literally dozens of Scripture verses that call us to humility as a path to relationship with God. And so if it is that important that it continues to pop up in Scripture, well, it makes me ask two questions. Number one, why is this one particular virtue so important? And number two, if it's that important, how do we do it? How do we live it? Well, we know that the opposite of humility is one of the 7 deadly sins, pride. And it is, in fact, one of the common colloquial definitions of pride that I think tip us off to why humility is so important. For one of the things we say when someone is proud is we say they're a bit full of themselves. And there's the ticket to our understanding. Because when someone is full of themselves, full of their ego, full of their accomplishments, their titles, their possessions, we find there's no room for anything else, most especially God. And so we are called to the opposite of being full of ourselves. We are called to humility. And yet I will guarantee you that all of us, to some degree, fail on that account, me especially. Let me give you 3 examples of where we can fail to be humble. The first is the failure to recognize that everything we have in life is gift. Now, I know that there are a lot of people in society that have worked hard to get where they are, and I'm not discounting that. But there is a fiction in American society, and in fact in most of Western society, of the self-made man or woman. None of us are self-made. All of us are made in the image and likeness of God. Our very lives itself, on which is the basis for everything else we do, is a gift. We didn't earn that life. And what we are able to create in our life is based on the talents and those charisms that each one of us have. Also gifts from God. So everything we have and everything we accomplish is a result of that giftedness. All we have and all we are is gift. In fact, the fall of Adam and Eve and the fall of Satan and his followers were based on this very fact that they failed to remember that they were dependent on God. They were dependent on themselves. They didn't need God anymore. And that was the cause of their fall. But even if we get it, even if we understand that what we have in our life is gift, sometimes we can still distort that. We can believe that if we have more gifts in our life, that somehow God has blessed us more because we earned it. There was the, dare I say, heresy of the gospel that talked about that we have, if we earn it, if we serve God more, we are going to earn more. And in doing that, what we're saying is that somehow we are more valuable than our sisters and brothers that have less. And that is an equal demonstration of pride. Now, there's a corollary to that as well, which was demonstrated by the Pharisee in the temple. Remember the guy who said, I'm so glad I'm not like that tax collector back there. Oh, sorry, Father. That tax collector back there. Thank God I'm not a sinner like him. That is equally a violation of that virtue of humility that we're all called to. The good news for us is that Jesus gave us the perfect example of a life of humility. He who was God emptied himself of his divine privilege. He humbled himself and took the form of a slave, obediently accepting death, even death on a cross. He literally put his life in his Father's hands. And that is what you and I are called to do. We are called to be less full of ourselves so we can be more full of God. So how do we do that? Well, I think how we do that is hidden right in the root word of the basis for humility, which comes from the Latin word humus, which can be translated as earth or dirt. To be humble, you and I are called to get a little dirty. We're called to step down off of our pedestals and stand in solidarity with those whose lives are a little dirtier than our own. Pope Francis has called even the shepherds of the church, the clergy, to be shepherds that smell a little bit more like the sheep. Well, the only way that you smell like sheep, I don't know, any of you own sheep? We had people in Colorado in my parish that did. The only way you smell like sheep is you get shoulder to shoulder with them. By the way, they don't smell very good. But none of us are called to be above anyone else. We are called to walk with those in need. And we have great examples through history in the lives of the saints. Saints Francis, Ignatius, Elizabeth of Hungary, and many, many more rejected their life of comfort and wealth to instead live lives of service. A week from now, next Sunday, Teresa of Calcutta, Mother Teresa, will be canonized as the latest saint of the church. And Teresa lived this life of service to the fullest. She lived with the poorest of the poor. I don't know if many of you have been to the slums in India. I have had that opportunity as well. And it is overwhelming poverty described in ways that you can't imagine unless you experience it. But she chose to leave her life and live in that squalor, feeding, bathing, and caring for the wounds of the sick and dying. That is the perfect way to live the life of humility. Now, all of us are not called to that radical rejection of our current lifestyle, so you all don't have to run to India right now. But all of us are called in some way, as I said, to step down from that pedestal and get just a little bit dirtier in our service to those in need. Now, if you'd like a practical modern example of this, I'm going to commend a book to you. The book is entitled The Power of Half by Hannah and Kevin Salween. And it's the story from just a few years ago of a family, an affluent family in Atlanta, Georgia, that accepted the challenge of their 14-year-old daughter, who said, "Why can't we live more simply so that we can better serve those in need?" And they found a way to do it. Now, I have a warning about that book. The Power of Half in the title is not a metaphor. It is an accurate description of what they did. That day in Segundo Barrio, the dust that was hanging over the neighborhood was not pixie dust. And I don't think I could have seen Tinkerbell through the haze if she was there. But just like that magic dust, the dust in Segundo Barrio had the power to transform. God calls all of us to get a little dirty. May the dust of humility transform us all.